If you're like most people who start the drawing journey, you're dreaming of the beautiful artworks your unleashed creativity will produce, with all the prestige, freedom, money, and popularity that will bring, not to mention social media success.
Yes, well, good luck with that. But if you're like everyone else, here are 10 tips if you're just starting out on the drawing journey that I believe will help you get to the place that you're dreaming of, only the real world version of that place. So, in no particular order, don't think of talent, think of learning to draw. When we start, we often start because partly we've got this idea that we've got some talent in drawing. Possibly we thought that ourselves when we looked at what we did in comparison to people around us at school, or possibly other people were saying, wow, that's a great drawing, you're really talented. The problem is when we start to think, well, what actually is it and how does it change what I do? Firstly, I don't believe that talent is a thing in most areas of life that some people are born with that gives them an advantage over others, except in the perhaps obvious sense that if I'm born with long arms and long legs, I could have an advantage in, say, basketball. But except for that sort of thing, I don't think that we're born with a particular advantage in a particular thing. But what I do think happens is that when we start to learn to draw, we're not at the same place as other people who start to learn to draw, because there are all sorts of skills that we use in drawing that we develop in other areas of life. And I think it's more readily understandable that some of us, by chance, happen to have had a life up till that point where we've learned more of the skills that are more useful in drawing: observation skills, how to hold a pen skills, hand-eye coordination skills. Learnt more and experienced, practice those skills more doing other things. And that's going to mean that when we start to draw, we're going to move through more easily than someone who hasn't had life experience that's taught and reinforced those skills in the same way. And the problem with thinking about talent is that often it becomes this thing that makes me think, I don't have to try hard. I don't have to do anything really, because it just flows out of me. And that's possibly the most unhelpful and untrue mindset that we can have when we start to learn to draw. My second tip is that when we start to draw, we shouldn't think of it as creating an artwork. We should think of it as an exercise that we're doing in learning to draw. Artists produce artworks, but when we start to learn to draw, we know that's not us. But for some reason, it's easy to think I have to produce, or I'm going to produce, this wonderful drawing at the end. And that mindset creates all sorts of very unhelpful situations to develop. We try and do things that are too complex, that are overwhelming, that are too large, that we don't have the skills for. And we either think we're doing great when we're not, or we get discouraged because we can see that we're not doing well. And if I think I'm producing an artwork, I'm going to be focused on not making mistakes. And that's very unhelpful, even for people who don't suffer from perfectionism. It's such an unhelpful mindset to have when we draw. We need to be free to take risks and to experiment and to explore when we learn. And that includes when we learn drawing. My third tip is to realize that you're not just the student in your learning experience, but you're the teacher as well. And therefore you need to do all the things that a teacher does in your drawing learning experience. You need to work out the curriculum. And let me say, at that point, you need to choose carefully according to where you want to end up. Teachers don't set books and assignments just because they're interesting. They set things that will take the students towards the goals that the course has. We need to have our goals in mind so we don't get distracted watching videos that might be entertaining or might be challenging, but they're not showing us things that we're intending to do anyway. We need to choose the material that our student is going to study carefully. And not every teaching material on drawing is the same. Many of them are incompatible. They actually explore ways of drawing that can't go together. And it's not that one's right or wrong, they're just different. But it's going to be very confusing if I try and teach both of them to myself. Besides maintaining discipline and making sure that the work is done on time, the final thing a teacher has to do is to mark the work. Because in marking the work, the student can see how well they've learned that material, and the teacher can see whether they need to stay in that place and do more of that sort of material before they move on, or if they are ready to move on, or if perhaps they need to go down a class, go back to some earlier material and reinforce that a little more securely. As the teacher, that's my role as well now. I mentioned this tip in the last one, but that's to have a goal with where we're going in our drawing. Now, it's really up to us, of course, what that goal is and what sort of categories we're talking about. But besides having a goal as to the sorts of drawings we would like to be able to do, and they often relate to artists who have inspired us to draw, but knowing where I want to get to will help me make the best, the wisest, the most productive choices about how to get there. It will stop me wandering off in a moment of enthusiasm and buying expensive materials that I don't really know how to use and don't really have a purpose in using them in the first place. Having a goal is such a good focus for improvement because it brings all of our decisions into a place where it's easier to see what's productive, what's helpful at this point, and what might not be. Now, of course, we can change our goals at any time, but the thing is we choose to change our goals and then we choose to make changes in how we're learning to draw. One of the biggest problems when we don't have goals is that we go too fast, faster than we've actually learned adequately, and we end up crashing and burning and being overwhelmed. In my own drawing journey, there are some things that have surprised me more than others, and this next tip is one of them. And that's the importance of learning to embrace mistakes, of not seeing them as a disaster, but actually seeing them as part of the learning process. They're part of the way we learn what we can do and what we have to practice more, and therefore they're very helpful. And because I'm not thinking I'm producing an artwork, I know that I'm learning to draw. I'm not worried about a line or a mark being wrong that's going to ruin my artwork. And that's the big problem, of course, when we think this has to be ready to frame for an exhibition at the end of drawing, even though I've only been drawing for 3 days. Somehow this has to be perfect. And I get overly focused on wrong learning techniques and wrong unhelpful ways of drawing, focused on not making mistakes rather than focused on learning to draw and learning to incorporate mistakes or simply lines and marks that aren't in the best place into my finished drawing. This can be hard if you have perfectionistic tendencies. The way I got rid of the struggles I had with perfectionism in my drawing was simply to say, I'm not going to draw in pencil anymore. I'm going to draw directly in pen and not use an eraser, not have an eraser. Put every mark in ink that can't be removed. I have to learn to take the risks. I have to learn to live with the possibilities of disaster. But I also get to experience that they hardly ever happen, and that when marks aren't in the right place, I can nearly always make it so that they're not particularly noticeable by the end. In fact, I learn ways of drawing to help that happen. So learn to see mistakes as your friend, showing you where you can concentrate your efforts in the next drawing. This next tip is really something to understand, and that is that, in my experience, 90% of a drawing success comes from what happens in our head, and about 10% comes from what happens with the pen or the pencil, paintbrush in our hand. And it's because we neglect the in the head stuff that we often struggle so much with what we're trying to do with the pencil, pen on the paper, because we haven't worked things out enough in our head to know what we're doing, why we're doing it, where we should be doing it. When I look at, say, a photo and I want to draw it, I'm needing to go through some sort of creative translation process to change that photo into marks on the paper using a pen with black ink rather than a digital printer. And if I start drawing before I've done that, then my drawing is going to show that I was putting marks on the paper that I didn't know really what they were for or what I was trying to do at the time. The problem is the 90% of, if you like, value input into our drawing that comes from our head doesn't actually take 90% of the time. It might only be 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 minutes before we start drawing, but it's what sets us up for the drawing. It's where we decide our overall goals, how we're going to change the reference or how we're going to attack certain challenges, where we're going to start, all the things that maximize our chance for drawing success, or at least a drawing that looks a bit the way we would like it to be. This next one is simple. Finish your drawings. Don't leave drawings halfway through, and finish them in one sitting. When we're learning to draw, I think we should always be not doing more than we can do in one sitting for a lot of really important educational reasons. A drawing picks up a certain tempo as we draw. We start slower because we're having to observe more and we're having to work out what's what. We're establishing our first points on the paper. As the drawing grows, then we have more points to reference from. We can go faster more confidently. And this picks up the tempo. With the increased tempo comes a nice gestural fluidity to our lines. And then at the end, we make all the overall adjustments that we can't make till we have a better idea of how the picture is looking. But I never learn this. I never learn how to finish a drawing, and I never learn the natural rhythm that a drawing has if I try and draw too much in one sitting so that I can't finish it. I end up with a lot of half-finished drawings, which may not be satisfying enough to sustain me in the long run. Or it may encourage a habit of giving up easily if I run into difficulties with a drawing rather than persevering and discovering that in fact I can make those mistakes virtually disappear. This next one's quick and simple. Don't keep trying harder at what's not working. If your drawings reach the point where drawing after drawing after drawing looks very much the same, and it's not a sameness that you're happy about, you see the same problems in drawing after drawing after drawing, then don't keep doing the same thing drawing after drawing after drawing. Shake something up, inject something very different into what you're doing to help you jolt out of whatever rut you've somehow got into, probably in your thinking rather than your drawing. One good way of doing this is drawing in half the time that we were drawing in. When we have to go faster, we often relax more and the pressure's off us because we're not expecting to do a perfect drawing anyway. Or we might change our medium, or we might draw larger or smaller. But whatever we do, change something because, well, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And what we don't want is to be spending years producing drawings that we're not happy with. This next tip is to do with how often we draw. Now, how often we draw is different for all of us. We may be at a stage of life where we can put hours a day in, or it could be there's just a few hours a week, really. But from an educational, from a learning point of view, the most helpful thing I can do is spend a shorter time more frequently than even a much longer time, but much less frequently. And maybe it's easier to see the point if we think of playing the piano. If I start learning the piano, I'm going to benefit far more by playing for 20 minutes every day, small practice pieces, than for 3 hours on Saturday trying to play a bigger piece, an actual piece of music. That's going to probably simply be overwhelming. And by doing it in smaller increments, I can learn and improve from day to day rather than from week to week. In fact, if the only lessons I learn are in between weekly or fortnightly or even monthly drawings, chances are I won't even remember what the problems I had in the last drawing were, and I won't be on the lookout to try and overcome that. But if it was just the previous day, then I know what to work on, or I know that I need to pull back and perhaps do something that's a bit simpler. Because whatever lessons are to be learned, I'm learning them quickly and I'm able to move out of the bad or unhelpful or ignorant habits I have and into ways that work better for me for where I'm wanting my drawing to end up. Again, notice if we know how we want our drawings to be going in some way, it helps guide and direct all our thinking. I need to have a tip about materials. So what's the best materials for a beginner to buy? The best materials to buy are the ones that you can afford to waste. that are cheap enough and accessible enough for where you live and what you have, that you can buy them and then use them with no thought of, oh, I've got to be careful, I don't want to waste it, this pen is worth this much, this paper is worth this much, oh, I have to do something special. None of these thoughts will help us learn to draw. They will just make us tense and develop very unhelpful habits for learning anything, including drawing. I need to be free to experiment and to try things without worrying about whether it's wasting ink or paper. And while it can feel nice to use quality materials, the impact on our drawing is, I believe, pretty much negligible when we first start. There is so much more to gain by having freedom with using up as much ink and paper, pencils, whatever, that we've got time to use. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hope these 10 tips are helpful in giving some thought with some directions as to how you can self-manage your drawing journey. It's a great adventure to be on, but let's also give ourselves every chance to get to the place that, as best we can work out at this point, is where we'd like to go, or somewhere in that direction at any rate. So, all the best with that. But whatever you end up doing, how often you do it, wherever you do it, and how you feel it turns out, make sure you have fun. And then you can't lose. I'll see you next video. Bye.